Chapter 4. The question of the disciples. Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming, and of the end of the world? Matthew 24:3. In the 23rd chapter of Matthew, Christ summed up the crimes of the representatives of the Jewish nation and further declared that the present generation would fill the cup of iniquity to overflowing. This they did by the crucifixion of Christ and the persecution of his followers. Christ indicated that God would thus visit upon them all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel unto the blood of Zacharias. Matt. 23:35. Following these words Christ pronounced the judicial sentence, "Behold, your house is left unto you desolate." Christ prefigured the desolation of the Jewish house of God by his departure from it, and Jesus went out, and departed from the temple. Matt. 24:1. This meant he would never return until he returned in judgment. When Christ pronounced that the temple would be desolate, the disciples were horrified. "Master, behold," they exclaimed, "what manner of stone and what manner of buildings?" Mark 13:1. How could the living God desert the beautiful temple wherein God had promised to dwell? The Jews expected that the temple of Jerusalem would be the center of worship for the entire world in the days of the Messiah. They believed that in his days the temple would be the glory and beauty of the earth, and God would manifest himself there. It was unimaginable that God would forsake the temple at Jerusalem during the Messianic age. In order to convince his disciples that the desolation of the temple meant utter destruction, Jesus added, "See ye not all these things? Verily, I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another, that shall not be thrown down." Matt. 24:2. Jesus meant to impress it upon their minds that he was speaking about the temple which they were admiring. Was it in vain that Jesus had tried to instruct them to look for a spiritual fulfillment of many prophecies? The disciples apparently could not eliminate from their thoughts the notion that the material temple would be the center of worship for the entire world. For them the destruction of the temple would be the end of the world. Yet Jesus clearly informed them, "There shall not be left here one stone upon another, that shall not be thrown down." This prophecy, as we mentioned before, was literally fulfilled in 70 AD. Titus, the Roman general who led the siege of Jerusalem, ordered the walls of the city and those of the temple to be demolished. So thoroughly was this accomplished that Josephus, the historian, commented, "There was left nothing to make those who had come thither believe it had ever been inhabited." Significance of the question. The disciples do not doubt, of course, that Christ's words would be literally fulfilled, for we read that upon the Mount of Olives they ask him privately, "Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming, and of the end of the world?" This question is important in our understanding of the prophecy that follows. We must never forget that the Olivet Discourse was given in answer to that specific question. This is not to say that the disciples had a distinct understanding of what their question involved. They had frequently revealed their confusion about the true nature of the Messiah and his kingdom, and Christ had upbraided them for their defective understanding. Even after his resurrection he called several of them, fools and slow of heart to understand all that the prophets have spoken. Nevertheless, despite the confusion evidenced in this disciples' question, we must discover what they had in mind when they interrogated Jesus concerning the destruction of the temple. To ascertain this, we may consult parallel passages. For instance, the question of the disciples is recorded a little differently in Mark and Luke than it is in Matthew. Here is a comparison of the three. Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming, and of the end of the world? Matt. 24:3. Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign when these things are all about to be accomplished? Mark 13:4. Master, when therefore shall these things be? And what shall be the sign when these things are about to come to pass? Luke 21:7. The above parallel passages suggest that there are two things which the disciples desire to know. First, they want to know when these things would come about, and second, they desire to know the sign as to when these things were about to be accomplished. The time and the sign of the time figure prominently in the question of the disciples. That their question relates to the destruction of the temple is obvious from the context. They had just been pointing to the temple and Jesus had declared concerning it, "See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another, that shall not be thrown down." Immediately then the disciples ask, "When shall these things be?" What could be more obvious than that the disciples are asking about the time when not one stone would remain upon another of the temple? If the writer has labored the point in showing that Christ's pronouncement concerned the temple then standing in Jerusalem, and that the disciples' question relates to the same temple, it is to be apologized. I have done this because I am aware that some premillennialists refer the Olivet Discourse to some future temple. They claim that Christ does not answer the question of the disciples in regard to the existing temple. Yet that is precisely what Christ is talking about, and that is the main concern of the disciples. Christ had made a prophecy of the destruction of the temple standing before him and his disciples, and they are asking him when this destruction would take place. Had a future temple been the subject of consideration, Christ would have so informed the disciples. Hardly would he have misled them in thinking he was speaking about a contemporary building when he had a future one in mind. We can thus rest assured that Christ gives the disciples a direct answer. The sign. The disciples want to know not only the when of the destruction, but the sign that would precede it. Notice that where Matthew declares, "What shall be the sign of thy coming?" Mark writes, "What shall be the sign when these things are all about to be accomplished?" And Luke states, "What shall be the sign when these things are about to come to pass?" After asking when these things shall be, the disciples ask, "What shall be the sign when these things are about to come to pass?" These things refer to the same matter both times. And as Christ also uses the expression "these things" in answer to them, we would have to admit to a sad state of confusion if Christ and his disciples had not been talking about the same subject. The form of the disciples' question in Matthew is different from that in Mark and Luke. Instead of the sign as to when these things would come to pass, the question reads, "What shall be the sign of thy coming?" The expression, "sign of thy coming," equates the expression, "sign when these things are about to come to pass." Matthew reveals that in the mind of the disciples the destruction of the temple indicated the coming of the Lord. The word he uses for coming is parousia, indicating the second coming of Christ. The question as stated in the Gospel of Matthew reveals that to the disciples the destruction of the temple was to occur at the second coming of the Lord. The disciples shared the common belief that the temple would remain throughout the new age introduced by the Messiah. The Jews thought that the temple would last until the end of time, and this idea was based on their interpretation of Old Testament prophecy. God had declared to Solomon, "I have hallowed this house which thou hast built, to put my name there forever." Psalm 78:68-69 declares, "He chose the tribe of Judah, the mount of Zion which he loved. And he built his sanctuary like high palaces, like the earth which he had established forever." Jewish interpretation of these biblical prophecies took for granted an everlasting temple that would become especially glorious when the Messiah came upon the earth. Their error consisted of the failure to realize that the earthly temple was but a type of the spiritual temple, Christ Jesus and his church. Even as the disciples did not understand that the kingdom would be spiritual, neither did they understand that the temple would be spiritual. There was no excuse for their ignorance, since Christ had indicated the spirituality of the temple during the gospel dispensation. In Matthew 12:6 he declared, "But I say unto you, that in this place is one greater than the temple." He asserted in John 2:19-21, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." But he spake of the temple of his body. And to the Samaritan woman he said, "Woman, believe me, the hour cometh, when ye shall neither in this mountain, nor yet at Jerusalem, worship the Father." In spite of these clear teachings, the disciples at this time could not grasp the reality of a spiritual temple. Their thoughts were still on the material temple at Jerusalem. So when Christ told them that the material house of God would be desolate, they could not help pointing at the temple and saying, "Master, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here. Surely this temple would remain until the end of time." Throughout the ministry of Christ, the disciples had been taught about the coming day of judgment. Matt 10:15, 11:22, 12:36-41-42, 13:39-49. Therefore, when they heard Christ pronounce a judgment against Jerusalem and its temple, it seemed natural for them to associate it with that great day of judgment about which they had heard so much. And as they had also been taught that the day of judgment was to occur at the second coming of the Lord, they associated the destruction with his second coming. That is why the question reads in Matthew, "And what shall be the sign of thy coming?" They thought that the Savior would not destroy Jerusalem and its temple until he came to put an end to the present state of the world at the day of judgment. The end of the age. Matthew adds another clause which is not expressed in the parallel passages of Mark and Luke, and of the end of the world. The word world is not an exact translation of the Greek ionos. The Greek word means age. The disciples asked when the end of the age would be and what would be the sign of it. According to Matthew, the disciples associated the parousia of Christ with the end of the age. Their question is, "What shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the age?" The fact that the disciples asked Christ concerning the end of the age presents a problem of interpretation. What was in the minds of the disciples when they asked concerning the end of the age? There is no doubt the disciples believed that the destruction of the temple and the end of the age were one and the same thing. The fact that both Mark and Luke omit the expression, "the end of the age," would indicate this. If the expression represented a totally different idea, undoubtedly Mark and Luke would have included it. The destruction of the temple, however, was associated in their minds with the end of the age, and the mention of the one would bring to mind the other. According to the Jews, there were to be two ages, this age and the age to come, the pre-Messianic age and the Messianic age. We believe that in Matthew the question has reference to the end of the Messianic age. In the parable of the tares, Matt 1339-40, the disciples were taught that the judgment would come at the end of the age. This could only be the Messianic age. The same teaching comes to the forefront in the parable of the dragnet, Matt 13:47-50. This parable pictures the judgment. So shall it be at the end of the world, the angels shall come forth, and sever the wicked from among the just, and shall cast them into the furnace of fire, there shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. These parables indicate the writer's concept when he used the expression, the end of the age. So when we read this expression in the disciples' question, we may be sure that they are asking for the sign of the end of the Messianic age. Whatever confusion there may have been in the minds of the disciples, Jesus in his answer separates the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple from the end of the Messianic age. He rightly divides their question into two parts. First, he speaks of the when and the sign of the destruction of Jerusalem, and secondly he speaks of the when and the sign of the end of the Messianic age, which would be contemporaneous with his second coming. The destruction of Jerusalem forms the content of section 1, 24:435, and the end of the age forms the content of section 2, 24:36-25:46.